So while preparing talks, and I always tend to over prepare, and I probably have like three at least 45-minute talks, but I think everyone's the way I am. And that might not be true, but my attention span for listening to somebody talk about something usually goes 30 minutes, maybe 45 if I'm lucky. So that's why I've tried to break this up into little bits and pieces throughout some of our sitting period. And I'm not going to go over all of the documents that I sent, because like one of them was the treatise, I think, on the Paramis by Acharya Dhammapala. I'm not exactly sure if I included that one or not, but I was kind of wondering as I prepared the list in my own manner, whether it would work sort of like a flow sheet in chemistry, with one quality, in fact, conditioning the next in a way that seemed natural. And my sense is that each of the paramis really includes all of the others, and it can be restated using the characteristics of the other paramis in their definition, and that each parami is like a hologram for the other one, for the other 9, actually. And the Buddha taught that generosity was the first of the paramis, because most people have something that they can relinquish. In the largest sense, generosity isn't giving away material things. It's non-clinging. And as you can see by thinking of that as the chart, the proximal cause of generosity is seeing what we can let go of. For myself, giving up attachments to ideas and attachment to views has been much more of a difficult challenge than giving away material things. And when I've been able to give up my attachment to views, it seemed like an act of generosity, both to myself and definitely to others. I can say in my partnership, I'm sure he finds that very generous, whether he realizes it or not. But for me, acknowledging that I'm giving up some views and attachments, it's an act of generosity. And I've been able to give up views when I've recognized that I didn't need them to protect my sense of self. In fact, they're easier to give up when I see that the attachment to views constructs a sense of separate self, and it adds to my suffering. There's a Zen teacher, Swen Sa. His students have reported that he often said, "Only keep, don't know mind." That's a little tricky. Only keep, don't know mind. And another teacher once said that a helpful mantra to be recited daily by anyone who teaches is, "I could be wrong." That's always useful. I've actually noticed myself, and it's very helpful in my relationship, because, I usually think that I know what I'm talking about and I'm right, but I have had the generosity to say, I could be wrong, and it's very helpful. Another manifestation of generosity is giving up destructive habits or lingering grudges. There's a subtle one, giving up the generosity of letting go of destructive habits and lingering grudges. In moments of clear seeing, which have come through practice and maybe just by grace, we can understand that anything we hold on to, whether material or emotional, is a potential source of complication and of suffering. And with that understanding, generosity can become much easier. Every moment of mindfulness is a moment of truthfulness. So we have morality. That's the second of the paramis. The commentary tradition says that morality has a composing effect. The practice of morality, thought of as harmonious living, steadies and balances the mind, composes the mind and allows it to see clearly. And seeing clearly, we know that there's a tremendous amount of inevitable pain that's part of life's experience. And the impulse to respond with impeccable morality, to not further pain, because that's to the inevitable discomfort of life, it can become spontaneous. And this is how we're supported by this in the 5 precepts. The parami of renunciation is often thought of as giving up something tangible in life. In the Buddhist scripture, it's usually to describe renouncing the world and joining the order of the monks and nuns. I find it more helpful to think of renouncing the habitual patterns of mind that keep me enslaved more than renouncing a particular lifestyle. And perhaps that's because at those times in my life when I've needed to make a choice in terms of a more skillful lifestyle or habit, my experience has been that my strong decision to make a change made the actual changing fairly easy. It's been much harder to change habits of the heart. It's not easy to stay balanced. The mind's habitual response to pleasant stimulus is to grasp at it. And its habitual response to unpleasant experience is to push it away. It's aversion. And neutral moments aren't so interesting. And so we tend to stop paying attention to them. I used to think in the beginning of my practice that things wouldn't feel good, or taste good, or sound good, or anything else good, because of a lot of practice stories that I heard talked about extinguishing lust. I still experience lust, believe it or not. And while renunciation means, to me, giving up outbursts of anger in favor of a more considerate, helpful response, but I still recognize when I'm annoyed. And so I believe that renunciation is more a question of not being bound by or being a victim of the desires and the angers that naturally arise as the result of having a body. I believe that this is the difference between a compulsion or an addiction, which is always burdensome, and the possibility of making conscious choices, which that's not burdensome. I don't see renunciation as the difference between monastic and non-monastic lifestyles, but between a victim of mind states driven by compulsions and being free to make a choice. Restraint is a characteristic of renunciation. Joseph Goldstein once said something about restraint allowed for the verification of the empty nature of sense desire. Restraint allows for the verification of the empty nature. So if we restrain ourselves, we're more likely to see the empty nature of sense desire. In thinking about restraint, the most mundane example comes to mind. You know, you probably do this too, but I receive a lot of emails after I've purchased a product. You know, usually I might get something on Facebook or something, and then I start getting all these emails that I ordered since I ordered something online, and there's all those ads, and then the next thing you know, there's these shopping opportunities that, you know, show up in my email box, and the first thought is, I don't need anything. And then the announcements, they have these, you know, catchy pictures and descriptions and, you know, that thing for my neck and that great thing for my chair and whatever, you know, a new pair of sweatpants while I'm sitting at Zoom. So, I say, well, I'll just scroll through for a minute. And then, not infrequently when I do this, I find something that I didn't want and I didn't need it 2 minutes before that. And in the moment of discovering it and noticing that it's attractive, I suddenly, think that I want it. And I think that it's the nature of the mind to move toward pleasant and, in a grasping way. And it's not my hope for myself that my practice will lead me to a time when there's no movement of my mind toward things that are pleasant. But what I hope will happen is that I'll never be driven or compelled by the wanting, or at least less of it. And so in the matter of online shopping, the rule for myself is not to make a decision in the midst of that moment of lust. So that restraint is allowing for a verification of the empty nature of sense desire. Wisdom is the fourth of the Paramis, and its characteristic is clarity. Clarity seems the naturally developing result of restraint. So here they are, connecting to each other. When the movements of the mind in greed and hatred and delusion are fueled by stories, I need this, I don't like this is boring, truly clear seeing isn't very possible. And when the movement of the attention fueled by the stories is diminished by the capacity for restraint, then clarity emerges. And so validating for oneself the third noble truth of the Buddha, that peace is possible in this very life, it requires only one moment of personal experience. In a moment, if that moment is free, it's free. If there's suffering, there's suffering. The clarity to recognize freedom, even a moment of freedom, can lead to faith, confidence that becomes unshakable. Otherwise, it's just hearsay. So it has to be acknowledged one moment at a time. And in a moment of clear awareness, we recognize the pain in our life and realize that we have the capacity to manage it. It's a great liberation to know that you don't need to be pleased in order to be happy. And I think that this leads to energy. On the list, there's a characteristic of energy that's, what's that great big word, indefatigable. There's a clarity, there's a characteristic about energy. And it doesn't mean that you never get tired. It's a resoluteness and a dedication to practice. I heard a story one time about Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, that he classically would say to students at the end of the first day of practice, maybe some of you have heard this before in various ways, he'd say, I'm sure many of you would like to go home. And then he'd laugh and he'd say, too late. I'm sure many of you would like to go home, too late. Once you're on the path, you're on the path. And there's a kind of resoluteness to dedication of the practice that can be aroused, that indefatigability of energy. And that flows on into, there's a point that each of us begins to intuit, that there's a way of life that's more graceful and more peaceful. And there's another point that's very important in developing practice when we experience the possibility for ourselves, and that requires patience. One way to look or to think about patience is reflecting on the ability to wait when anger arises in the mind. Lots of things make us angry. Often we feel the victim of something, and especially when we feel like we're unjustly a victim, a lot of energy comes around righteous indignation. Patience allows us to wait until this cloud of anger, which distorts the mind, subsides so we can decide on an appropriate action. I once heard someone say that they heard, hearsay, that someone asked the Dalai Lama, "Do you ever get angry?" And he responded, "Of course, things happen. They're not what you wanted to have happen. Anger arises, but it's not a problem." There's the difference. It's not a problem. We're seeing it. We're perhaps letting it fall away. Coming back to renunciation or resoluteness. Sylvia Bornstein talks about an occasion when the Dalai Lama was teaching about patience, and he used his text Shanti Deva's Guide to Bodhisattva Way of Life. And he read each verse of a chapter, which was on patience, 134 verses, and commented on each one. Each verse proposed a different situation in which anger arises in the mind and proposed appropriate responses. And as the Dalai Lama read the last verse, he leaned forward and he held his head. Since her principal hindrance is worry, she thought, "Oh dear, something's happened to him." And then he picked up his head and she saw that he was crying. And since she knew that he's taught this chapter and verse many times, she was touched by how much it obviously moved him to say that any response to vexation other than patience is unwise. Just unwise. If we have the patience to wait, waiting can lead to clarity. And clarity allows for the truth of the situation to emerge. So the next parami is truthfulness. Every moment of mindfulness is a moment of truthfulness, of direct knowing. Direct and clear, true understanding is such a relief. It inspires determination in practice. And when we see the truth of how things are, our capacity for loving kindness, for metta, increases. We see people just the way they are, as people, like ourselves, struggling to be content, to be happy, to live gracefully, not as people about whom we have a lot of commentary about, or that puts them in categories of friends or enemies. As we become less judgmental and more tolerant, more able to understand the things, that things and people are the way they are, as a result of complex and legitimate causes, our capacity for balance and equanimity increases. So in choosing a story in the service of creating and editing an edited version of a whole days of teaching on the Paramis, here's a story that combines the capacity for seeing the truth, the determination to tell the truth, a moment of genuine metta, and the joy of equanimity. And this is told by Sylvia. She says in the late 1990s, she was fortunate to be part of a group of 26 Western teachers of Buddhism who went to the Dharmasala to meet the Dalai Lama. A trip to India is difficult under any circumstances. and the Dharmasala is harder than Delhi. Nevertheless, this was a trip she would not have missed. She was excited about meeting the Dalai Lama and excited to meet the 25 other teachers. The group of teachers gathered for several days before meetings with the Dalai Lama to establish the agenda for their time with him. She said she knew perhaps half of the other teachers and only some of them very well. And so at the start, she noted that there were really 3 categories of people there. People she knew well and liked, people she didn't know at all, and a few people she knew but didn't have very good feelings about. For various reasons, all in the past, she was negatively affected by these people in some way. And there they all were, far away from home, and all of them with a kind of high alertness. And so on their first day of meeting together, Jack Cornfield, who was the facilitator, said, "Let's go around the room and introduce ourselves. Each of us will say our names and what we see as our current and greatest spiritual challenge in our personal lives and in our teaching lives." So she thought, this is a most intimate question to respond to in a group of 26 people, most of whom she didn't know. But she couldn't leave. She couldn't say, "I've decided not to come to Dharmasala." She didn't even have to make a decision about when to talk, because Jack said, "I'll go first. I'll pass the microphone around and everyone will go in order." She said she had the same feeling that she's had halfway down a ski slope or in a dentist chair midway through a complicated procedure, or indeed in the middle of life. There's no place to go but forward. So in the clarity of that realization, her mind relaxed and she listened. Each person's story seemed touching to her, and everyone told the truth about his or her current struggle. And by, the people she had negative feelings about told their stories as well. And she discovered that she felt the same about them as about the people before and after them. Her mind was clear and focused. She was relaxed. She wasn't adding to that experience all the stories she had in her memory bank. And she was seeing everyone just as they were. And it was a tremendous relief. Her insight that we are all, after all, just doing our best with the circumstances of our lives to manage gracefully, authentically, and with integrity, had a transformative effect. Then everyone became her friend, and she felt a friend to everyone. Equanimity, which is the last of the Paramis, is the ability to feel and understand in wisdom that everyone and everything is different, legitimately, as a result of different causes, and to live in a friendly, non-adversarial relationship with all things, with all people, and with all our lives is the source of great equanimity. So that becomes the list of the 10 Paramis in a user-friendly version rather than the one where I would go over step by step the 10 perfections of the heart that is written in more complicated manner. So let me see how the time looks. What did I have planned? We're going to have some practice questions, and but I think it would be nice maybe to do a longer walking period first. So let's take a few minutes, like maybe 15, for walking. And as you're using this walking period, I had a couple of questions to ponder, but I have to find where they are in my notes now. Here we go. Maybe. Yeah, why don't you take some time as you're walking? And we can talk about this when we come back, to notice if there are any ways that you might see that these paramis, or which one of the paramis, can influence your daily life and your practice. But in the very moment while walking, just be present. In this walking, there's walking. And maybe stop at the end of your walking path and stop and contemplate something about the paramis. And then as you turn and walk the other way, be present. Be present for that spacious moment of awakening between the in-breath and the out-breath, or between the step of the pressure of the foot on the floor. And so just take this time to continue with intention of lifting, moving, placing, walking.